one more guest, couple of different sports we're going to talk about here on today's show. That is Kyle Hunter of HunterSportsPicks.com. Kyle, how's it going today, man?
Going pretty good, man. Certainly a busy time of the year here. As a handicapper, there's so many things going on right now. So it's great as a fan. It can be difficult as a handicapper with so many different things going on. But 16-5 in my last 21, so it's been nice to be on a nice little heater here of late.
Yeah, and it's especially challenging because you're trying to play a little bit of catch up with college basketball. I think normally you feel like you're a little bit more advanced at this point in the season, but timing is everything in life, as we know. And of course, you got sick right at the start of the college basketball season, and I know that your children have been battling some things as well. So, when it is a heavy time of year like this, where you've got all this college football, you're still looking at NBA and NHL, and then you've got college basketball, and we talk about this all the time with the number of teams that there are in college. How are you keeping your head above water? I mean, what are you focusing on here? At this time of the year with the majority of your time?
Well, I mean, football drives the bus, as we say, in the industry, and I have to stay very focused on football. I've spent a lot of time still on college football, quite a bit of time on the NFL. Certainly that's still where the majority of my time is going. As far as college basketball, what I've tried to do is, specialize on totals here of late. Totals are certainly, I'm a lot better at totals than I am at sides, especially in college basketball. I started the year off slowly in college basketball, and now I've won my last 7 plays in college basketball. I believe all of those were totals. I've been trying to play the angles that I know are really strong angles early in the season with like the neutral site unders and things like that. Like you said there, I would say most years I know more about a bunch of these teams than what I do right now for college basketball. And that's why my volume's been lower, but I've been able to do well just by sticking to what I know the best. And you can't know everything about every team, especially when, you get hit with sicknesses, like you said. I'm feeling better than I was, but the kid's still not doing well. And, you got to be a dad first. And there's a lot of different sports going on, as we said. So, I try not to be an expert in every single thing or try to, stretch myself too thin. So try to keep it simple and focus in on the things where I believe I have an edge.
I think, honestly, I mean, it may work out for you in the long run, and we'll have to revisit this topic, once we see how things are going with college basketball. But, early on in the year is when you feel like you do a lot of preseason work, when you feel like you can get edges in an inefficient market. But sometimes it's not the worst thing in the world to kind of ease into it a little bit, get a better idea of what we're seeing, because ultimately early on in the year, you do your research, you have your expectations, you think you know how things are going to go. Obviously, it doesn't always play out that way. But, with specializing in what you're good at, specializing in the conferences that you know really well, and then specializing in some of those neutral site angles, that's stuff that can really help you, can boost up the bankroll, can help the clients as you're doing that research behind the scenes to familiarize yourself with some more of these teams. So, honestly, I think it may kind of be a blessing in disguise, so to speak. And obviously, I hope your children are feeling better. But it could be one of those things where circumstances actually wind up helping you a little bit more. There may be no way of knowing that because we don't know how you would have started the season if you were able to dedicate, a similar amount of time to what you usually do. But still, I think that it may, wind up being something that does work out for you. And we talk about this all the time, that as a handicapper, it's all about adapting and adjusting. And, I've said this before on the show here within the last couple of weeks, that I honestly feel like in-game is, really the future of the industry, and it's going to be the way that everybody goes about doing this, and you have to make the adjustments to that. But also you have to make year-to-year adjustments because not all of these seasons are going to be the same.
Right, absolutely. You have to adjust based on what's going on in your life and adjust what's going on in the markets as well. So, I feel like that's what I'm trying to do here. And obviously, you look at a month from now, I'll know a lot more about a bunch of these teams in college basketball. But, I am learning about these teams as we go, and, as anybody should, I've just been trying to watch as much college basketball as I can, so even sometimes when I'm sitting up with the kids at night, just watching some of the games that are on and learning about these teams and making some notes as far as the future because, you watch some of those games, you find out about tendencies of the teams, and, you learn something that can try to help you on your next bet.
All right, well, let's get into the college football side of things here, and then we've got some listener requests and some listener questions on the college basketball side that we'll wrap up with. Let's start with this Friday night conference championship game in the Pac-12. Stanford takes on USC, and USC a 3-point favorite here this game at a neutral site in Santa Clara, California, home of the San Francisco 49ers. So not any real home field advantage to be gained here in this one. But, I think this is a really tricky handicap because you've got this Stanford team with a banged-up Bryce Love. We know it. They know it. Everybody knows it. You've got this USC team, though, that hasn't lived up to expectations this year. Sam Darnold, probably hasn't had the type of season that everybody expected. Clay Helton, kind of hit or miss there with him. You do have a head-to-head meeting to look back to here, but that was all the way back in week 2. And I think that's kind of a starting point here, Kyle, to discuss some of these conference championship games is, a lot of times these teams have played each other throughout the course of the season. So how much stock do you put in that first matchup?
Well, I don't put too much stock in that first matchup right now because, like you said, it's so long ago. If you look at that game, USC completely dominated that game, had more than 600 yards of offense. This Stanford defense has certainly gotten better since then. And I think that David Shaw has proven himself as a very good coach. I know he's had some bad moments and in-game spots, but his teams get better throughout the course of the season. I would give Stanford a coaching edge in this game. And as you said, I think USC has certainly not played up to expectations so far this year, especially in the passing game. I think their offensive line's been a disappointment, and that certainly played a role in Darnold not looking as good. Like you said, it makes it tricky that Bryce Love is not playing at 100%. If Love were playing at 100%, well, first of all, the line probably wouldn't be what it was, but I would like Stanford more in this one. I think that it would be a mistake to read too much into that first game. It was at USC, and it was a really long time ago. I feel like Stanford has improved quite a bit since then. Stanford's best wins are at home, of course, and this is not a home game. But I feel like Stanford can run on USC. USC's run defense has not been very good this year. And, even Bryce Love being hobbled, he's still been playing pretty well. And, I've said this in the past on Twitter, and I'll say it again. I think Bryce Love's the best player in the country this year. He's not going to win the Heisman. He probably should. But I think, he's really done a really good job, even though he's not playing at 100%. I think Stanford's defense is quite a bit improved from what they were before. My lean here is to take Stanford in the points. I will say this is not a very strong lean. I think, the public's going to want to take USC here in this one, though I don't know how heavily. It'll be interesting to see how much sharp action there is on Stanford here.
I do think there will be a little bit of a sharp versus public split in this game. This number opened 3, and it's 3 minus 15 pretty much all across the market here. So USC getting a little bit of the initial nibbles, but obviously this number hasn't moved off of 3. And one of the things that stands out between the first game and the second game here, KJ Costello didn't play the second game for Stanford. And a lot of people believe that he's an upgrade to Keller Christ. And obviously I think that there's a decent amount of evidence that would suggest that probably is the case. I mean, really, if you're a Stanford quarterback, you're simply out there to complete a few play-action passes, extend drives on 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7, and then let the running game and the offensive line take over. Costello against Notre Dame, only 14 of 22, but 4 of those 14 completions went for 6. So I think that this is also a situation where Stanford has been upgraded a little bit with KJ Costello, both from an actual performance standpoint and also from a power rating standpoint. So it really wouldn't shock me here to see this become a sharp versus public game with, as you mentioned, the public on USC and the wiser guys taking Stanford.
No, that wouldn't surprise me either. And now that we have actual total numbers to talk about as well, I would say I think this total may be a little bit too high. Both of these teams play relatively slow. Stanford certainly plays at a very slow pace. That first game influencing the number here a little bit. They got to 66 in the first game. We've seen Stanford slow the game down, use up the clock, really long drives, a lot of running. I think they'll do that again here. USC's passing game was really good in that first game. They probably won't have as much success there. So my slight lean here would be to the under just from a number standpoint as well.
No, I think that makes sense. I mean, right now you're looking at this total 57.5. The total was 55 for the first game between these two teams. As you mentioned, that one did go over the number. And another thing about it, too, is when you have these Heisman hopefuls early on in the season, like a Bryce Love, like a Sam Darnold, you want to try and give them as many opportunities as possible to strengthen that case. In this game, with the Heisman already decided and going to Baker Mayfield, you don't have to worry about that as much. You're still going to put the ball in the hands of your best personnel, which would be Love and Darnold, but maybe the tempo does slow down a little bit more for this game, especially if it's close late, one team nursing a lead, something like that. The I don't want to say expectations, but the mindset changes from a regular season game to a conference championship game, where you're talking about a better bowl game, you're talking about some program hardware, you're talking about maybe a recruiting windfall, some kind of thing like that. So, I think that because we saw that first game go over, like you said, there's a little bit of an inflation on the total for this game. And I think this game just plays a lot differently than a run-of-the-mill Week 2 regular season game.
Yeah, I think so too. I think as you see the game mean more to both teams and the intensity goes up, in general that helps the defenses, and like you said, this one's a little bit higher than the total was there in Week 2. My lean here is the under. Speaking
of high totals, I know you're going to be very excited to play back on the under for this one. Between Memphis and Central Florida, 85.5 is the total for this game. Spread Central Florida -7. Juice pretty standard across the market at -115. So it's an interesting spot for both of these teams because obviously everyone remembers Central Florida beating Memphis in that game that had to be rescheduled because of the hurricane. Memphis wound up being in a pretty bad spot for that one. Central Florida, that was really the only hallmark win that they had up until last week's game against South Florida. They needed a kick return touchdown in a very back-and-forth affair against the best team that they've played since Memphis to win that game. So are you surprised to see this line, either side or total, where it is?
Well, from a total standpoint, you have to set the number really high here. First of all, public's going to take the over in a big way. And both of these teams play so fast that there's going to be a ton of possessions here. Having said that, there's no way I could play over 85.5. That's just it's just way too high. That's you got to put up some really high points every single quarter. One bad quarter and you lose that over. I can't do that. Having said that, do I like to take the under? No, I don't want to take the under here either. I'm going to pass on this total. I like the side better. I like Memphis some here, especially if you can get 7.5, which I think there are a couple 7.5s with extra juice, and I think there will probably be some 7.5s at some point throughout the week. Obviously, getting 7.5 points doesn't mean quite as much when you have a total of 85.5, but still more than a touchdown with a team in Memphis that I believe has improved a lot since that first game. And UCF was outplayed by quite a bit in much of that game last week against USF. USF had 653 yards in that game, 7.77 yards per play, a little bit of a misleading final. And, UCF maximized their trips into the red zone and won that game. But this UCF defense has shown quite a bit of flaws here of late, and I think Memphis can expose them quite a bit here.
No, I completely agree. I wanted to play on Memphis to begin with, and I wanted Central Florida to look really good against South Florida. I do have South Florida in a team wins pool, so I was hoping they'd find a way to pull that one out. But from a betting standpoint for this game, I wanted Central Florida to look really good. It certainly didn't help that Memphis hung a 70-burger on East Carolina, but that doesn't really influence too much of anything because East Carolina is terrible. But the fact that Central Florida gave up 503 passing yards on 24 completions, South Florida had 21 yards per catch in that game. That's not great, especially when you take on an offense led by Riley Ferguson. Now, you do have some interesting coaching situations here in this game. Scott Frost going to take a Power 5 job. Mike Norvell being talked about for a Power 5 job. So you do have two coaches here that you kind of wonder what the state of their mindset is. You kind of wonder where the players are looking. Now, Norvell, I saw yesterday that there were some talks that he may be looking to extend with Memphis, which is a very big surprise there. But, I think that it's such an interesting handicap because you have this high-scoring game. You have a last team with the ball wins potential situation. You've got Memphis getting blown out early in the season in this game, where Central Florida opened, I think, 2.5 or 3. Number closed 5.5. I don't see any reason why this number should be a total or be a touchdown with reduced juice or the 7.5s that are out there. Honestly, if I look at the body of work from when these two teams last played, I'm more impressed with what Memphis has done. I mean, Central Florida lost 3 of the last 4 games against the spread as their numbers got higher and higher, as their perception got higher and higher. Memphis is mostly covered almost every game. They failed to cover by a half point against Navy on October 14th, found a way to come back against Houston. I like this Memphis team a lot, and I'm hoping to catch a 7.5 out there as the week goes along. I don't know if I'll sprinkle the money line necessarily, but I think the Tigers are the right side here.
Yeah, I think so too. And like you said, UCF has actually not played as well of late. They had that close win at SMU. At Temple, I believe they were outgained in that game. Temple turned it over a bunch of times. And then last week they were really outplayed by South Florida. Memphis, I think, has really came on and played a lot better as the season's gone on. UCF started the season really strong, and it's been, good of late, but not great. So I think this number's too high.
All right, well, let's go to the Conference USA Championship game here, game 315, 316 on the board. North Texas takes on Florida Atlantic. Florida Atlantic up to a 10.5-point favorite, standard minus 110 out there in the marketplace. And this is another one that's interesting because you've got a previous matchup between these two teams. Florida Atlantic with a very nice win, hung 69 points in that one, 69-31. But North Texas was in basically the worst spot that they had all season, possibly the worst spot in college football of the year. Off that big UTSA comeback win, Mason Fine got his ass kicked all game long. He took a beating, including on the final play that won them the game. Just an awful, awful spot for the Mean Green. Going down to Boca, lost by 38. It seems like that one may have a little bit of an influence on this number as well.
Yeah, Jeffrey Wilson is out for this game, North Texas running back. They do have some good running backs still available, so I think that hurts them some. Mason Fine's really good. I think he's going to be really, really good in this system that's going forward. Florida Atlantic's defense is not likely to be able to stop North Texas here. Having said that, I do wonder, Florida Atlantic put up over 800 yards of offense in this first game between these two. This is a total that I would still lean to the over on. I think, I'd like it to be lower, and I played the over the first time these two played at a number that was quite a bit lower than this. But I still think there's going to be a lot of points in this game. Florida Atlantic's rushing game, very, very good. North Texas can't stop the run. North Texas should be able to throw on Florida Atlantic. I don't see either team stopping each other very much. I really don't have a lean from a side standpoint that much. I do think this number's probably a little bit too high numbers-wise. My number is a little bit smaller than this. But, like I said, North Texas a little bit banged up. It'd be interesting to see, we obviously don't know this far ahead, but what's the weather going to be like, how much wind? You can get some wind in places like this sometimes. And then also you have, Florida Atlantic that relies on the run game, North Texas more on the pass game, especially with Wilson out. That would help Florida Atlantic a little bit. And like you said, the thing, if you like North Texas was in a really bad spot in that first game. And the line may be a little bit inflated because of that first game, as you said. Certainly the public's going to take Florida Atlantic here. I see, already 73% of the bets are on Florida Atlantic here. And, those are probably not too many public players. But I think that Florida Atlantic will take most of the bets here. I imagine some people will want to take North Texas plus the points here later in the week. It'll be interesting to see what happens with this line.
Yeah, it will, and I like both coaches here. I think Lane Kiffin's done a phenomenal job at Florida Atlantic, and Kendall Briles, say what you will about what happened at Baylor and if he should have a coordinator position, but he has done a good job putting this offense together. And Florida Atlantic's offense did start a little bit slow. I mean, keep in mind, this is a team that lost to Buffalo. Wasn't the greatest of spots, but this is a team that lost to Buffalo early on in the year. And then they've just basically bludgeoned almost everybody in conference play with the exception of Marshall. They did have that game covered. We all remember how that one played out, and apologies to anybody that was on Florida Atlantic in that one, and I'm opening up some bad wounds there. But, a lot of credit to both of these coaching staffs. Seth Luttrell's done a phenomenal job in Denton with North Texas, and we'll see how long it takes him to upgrade his job, maybe even this year, taking one of those open group of 5 spots, maybe in the AAC, something like that. So, 2 really good coaches here. One thing that is interesting about this game is that you mentioned the total adjustment already. It was 67 was the closing number when these two teams played October 21st, but the line was 3.5, and that was with North Texas in a really terrible spot. The spot's not bad here at all. Jeffrey Wilson, probably 1.5, maybe 2 points to this number in terms of a power ratings adjustment for North Texas, just because he's been such a potent running back even when they weren't very good. But to see this number adjust by a touchdown, I know maybe North Texas's body of work isn't all that great. They gave up 49 to Army. They barely beat Louisiana Tech on the road, although they were a dog. Couldn't cover against Old Dominion after that Florida Atlantic game. But a touchdown adjustment seems like a lot here. That's not to say I'm going to play North Texas, but this is one where there's some recency bias built into this number.
Yeah, I agree with you. I didn't realize it was that big an adjustment as far as the side. And I remember that total before I got bet up really hard. I think I got over 61 or 61.5 or something like that at the open, and then it went up pretty quickly. As far as the total, I still think I like the over a little bit, like I said. I don't think I'll play it this time. And on the side, I think I'll probably pass here. I don't know if North Texas can stop Florida Atlantic enough, and, some bad things can happen when you're throwing the ball a lot. So I don't know if I trust North Texas a lot here, but I agree with you. If you're just going from a number standpoint, I think this number should probably be something like 7.5 or 8 instead of 10.5. And so, if you want to get a numbers grab, then couldn't blame you for taking North Texas either.
All right, let's head on down to the Sun Belt here. Troy takes on Arkansas State. This one's kind of a de facto conference championship game. Both of these teams tied at 6-1 in conference. Appalachian State also 6-1. They'll probably beat Louisiana Lafayette. They're a 15-point favorite there in that game. So whoever wins this one looks like they'll share the Sun Belt crown with Appalachian State. At least all of them, or both of them, having 7-1 records. But really good game here down in Jonesboro. Troy, 1.5-point dog in this one. Number open 2. So we haven't seen a lot of significant investment as of yet. Total 58.5 for this one. But these are 2 really solid programs. Arkansas State has certainly benefited from having Blake Anderson there for a few years. Of course, they had Hugh Freeze. They had Gus Malzahn. Both of those guys there, and in the blink of an eye, they were gone. So for Arkansas State, nice for them to get a little bit of stability, a little bit of consistency there. But this Troy team, last year they were the first Sun Belt team to ever be ranked in the top 25, playing very well here over the last few weeks. Arkansas State, kind of struggling a little bit defensively last week, played some dregs before that, lost to South Alabama. So I think this is a kind of a high-variance game, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I like Troy in this game. Arkansas State won 35-3 last year when Troy turned it over 5 times. Arkansas State didn't turn it over at all, and that game was at Troy. Arkansas State was plus 10 in that game, so certainly a big surprise. Arkansas State's won 4 years in a row here. I think this is a good revenge spot for Troy. I think situationally, motivation-wise, I like Troy here. And Troy is obviously proven they have a high upside. Say what you will about LSU, they ended up having a good season, and Troy went and won at LSU there earlier this year. To me, Troy just has the higher upside of these 2 teams, and I think they, like I said, they should be extremely motivated for this game. I'm certain they remember last year's game where they lost 35-3 and were completely embarrassed. The thing I will say about that game is Arkansas State only had 388 yards of offense. Now, Troy only had 262, but the final is a little bit misleading because Troy turned it over 5 times. I think Troy's defense is a little bit better than Arkansas State's. I like Troy's motivation level here. I just think this is a really good spot for them to come back and You know, a team that's beaten them 4 times in a row. Now Troy should be extremely motivated. Troy's only 4-7 against the numbers so far this year, and I think that has odds makers a little bit low on them because, you know, they got so high on Troy right after they beat LSU, and then Troy has a little bit of a rough patch there, and now they're playing really well again. So I think from a number standpoint, I think Troy is undervalued right here, and I think Troy wins this game.
All right, one thing I want to touch on before we transition over to college basketball for today, obviously the coaching carousel spinning at a rapid pace right now. You got Dan Mullen making the move over to Florida. You've got Chip Kelly at UCLA. You've got what looks like maybe Kevin Sumlin going to Arizona State. Scott Frost is going to wind up somewhere in all likelihood. You have the debacle in Knoxville with Greg Schiano and everything that happened there with that. Just a very busy time of year from a coaching standpoint. We'll talk more about all of them on next week's show, but there's one in particular that I want to look at, and this is one of those head scratchers. I don't know if this winds up being a USC-type situation with Clay Helton getting elevated, but the fact that Ole Miss took the interim tag off of Matt Luke was very, very surprising to me, as I'm sure it was to you.
Yeah, and when you started saying that, I knew you were going to say Ole Miss. Yeah, I actually read that one on the bottom of the screen on ESPN yesterday, and I said, wow, just out loud. I'm really surprised by that, Not that he did a bad job necessarily, but I'm just surprised that Ole Miss and the SEC, and with some decent tradition there, would not try to find a bigger name than that. And I think they probably could have gotten a fairly good name in there. That's not to say that I think that he'll necessarily do a bad job long term, but, you wonder if Ole Miss winning that game against Mississippi State had something to do with that. And if it did, it might be a mistake to read too much into that game. Nick Fitzgerald getting hurt right at the beginning of the game. Let's just be honest. I mean, Mississippi State probably would have won that game if he stayed in there. So, I wonder if that had something to do with it, though.
Yeah, I mean, it could have. I think part of it, too, is that with all the Hugh Freeze fallout, you make a decision to go to Matt Luke, and you had 2 first-year coordinators, offensive and defensive, so you probably weren't going to elevate either one of those guys. So you want to find a guy with a little bit of tenure within the program that knows the personnel and that the players, respect and will rally around. And I kind of feel like it's one of those things where you're a little bit gun-shy. You don't want to go out there and get a big name and possibly wind up embroiled in some sort of scandal down the road. Also, there probably weren't a whole lot of big names interested in this job because the sanctions and the fallout from Hugh Freeze, not just from the escort service thing, but also you and I have talked about on this show before, and no knock on Oxford, no knock on the Grove, no knock on this university, but the really high-level recruiting classes that Hugh Freeze had, it's just naturally going to open up some eyes. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast in college football. So I kind of wonder how much interest there was from some of these bigger names with some of those unknowns of possible scholarship reductions or additional sanctions down the road. So it almost feels like Ole Miss kind of had to make a, pardon the pun, a lukewarm decision here. And maybe they'll look to do something in a year or two once the sanction picture gets a little bit clearer. But also, too, it's such a tough job to go against Auburn now playing at a very high level once again. Alabama, obviously, if LSU ever finds a quarterback, they're right there. We'll see what happens with Mississippi State with Dan Mullen gone. Texas A&M without Kevin Sumlin, maybe they're a program that actually lives up to its potential with being the only SEC school in Texas. So is this maybe Ole Miss kind of not punting the next 2 years, so to speak, but just sort of, trying not to upset the apple cart? I don't know, but it feels to me like with some of the names that were out there, you kind of want to shoot your shot as long as somebody's interested.
Yeah, I'm surprised that they didn't try anything more than this, and I think it'll be really interesting to see what their recruiting classes look like now in the next couple of years. How good of a job does he do recruiting? Like you said, Ole Miss has had some really good recruiting classes, and it'll be interesting to see how he does on that side of it.
All right, let's transition over to the college basketball side here, spend some time on that. I know you've gotten a couple of listener questions here about some early season college basketball betting, including looking at some teams to buy low and sell high. Yeah,
and I like doing this. It's one of those stock market indicator type things. And being a guy that likes to follow the stock market, I feel like that's a good way to look at teams in all sports as well. You got to try to find a team when everybody's low on them that's going to bounce back and try to sell high on some of these teams that can't keep playing the way they have been all year. UIC is the first team I would say I'm going to give a couple to buy low on and a couple to sell high. UIC, Dikembe Dixon, really talented player. He was out last year. UIC is shooting really poorly so far this year. 40% from the floor, 29% from three-point range. That should improve. UIC has played a couple of real good teams here as well early in the season. And I think that UIC just, you look at an ATS standpoint, they're not covering numbers right now. They have a good coach. They have a really good player in Dikembe Dixon. I assume that they're going to start playing better here pretty soon.
So what do you look for then, specifically? I mean, do you have target numbers in mind in the market when these lines come out? Are you looking to, do you think that there's a recency bias or a perception that comes into play? I know you expect the team to get better, but, in a more tangible sense, what are you looking for in terms of the lines?
Yeah, it's hard to say, obviously, but without seeing a line for their games ahead, it's hard to say, this is what I would say is my buy point. And as we said earlier, I'm not as advanced on these college basketball numbers and teams as I would be normally. But what I'm really looking for in UIC is I'm looking for this team to continue to play good defense like they did last year. They haven't played great defense so far this year, but Dikembe Dixon has been a really good defender in the past. He's their best offensive player, and he was out last year. So what I'm looking for is them to play against another team who's not very good, doesn't shoot the ball that well, and UIC to be able to get right. I think that UIC, there's just going to be some spots coming up where you can find a team like them where the odds makers have kind of lowered them quite a bit from getting beaten down a couple times and not covering the number. And I think the UIC team that we will see later in the season hasn't shown up yet. I think that will. From a number standpoint, it's kind of hard to say just without delving into their matchups coming up too much. This is just a team that I feel like will be undervalued here for a couple weeks. And then the next team I wanted to say, St. Mary's, a great coach in Randy Bennett. This team has played some really tough opponents so far this year, and they're 1-4 against the spread. St. Mary's is going to be good again this year. They do what they do. They do it really well. They play slowly. They're really efficient on offense. They take care of the basketball. I think they're going to do that again this season, and I think once we get into West Coast Conference play, St. Mary's is going to be covering numbers again. This is a team that can really run up the score based on how efficient their offense is. I know they lost some key pieces from last year, but I expect them to be good again this season.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And those are – it's interesting when you get the mid-majors that wind up having sustained success for a while because, sometimes that has to do with having once-in-a-generation or twice-in-a-generation types of players. But if you're a mid-major – that can go out there and play some of those big non-conference games, can go to the tournament, or at least go to the conference championship game against Gonzaga, that resonates with recruits. And that's why teams like St. Mary's, Gonzaga, Wichita State obviously being the most notable example, that's why those teams can do what they do year after year. So I agree with you. It may take some time based on the roster turnover that they have, but still, this is a program with a really strong pipeline, and that ultimately tends to show through.
Yeah, and it will again this year. It's just a matter of time, and I think St. Mary's is one of those teams. We've talked about this in the past when we do the buy low, sell high. St. Mary's is one of them that I'd look as a long-term look to buy low on. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm going to dive in on them right away, but I do think that long-term, this will be a team that's pretty good against the number, and they're only 1-4 so far against the spread. So good buy low for the long term. As far as selling high, Washington State, they have won some really nice wins here of late. But, I really don't think Washington State's going to continue to be. I mean, they're 6-0. They beat St. Mary's on a neutral court, which was really impressive. They beat San Diego State last night on a neutral floor. Flynn has been really good for them. Malachi Flynn, a sophomore there, really has led this team really well. I still don't think that Washington State's as good as some of these other teams in the Pac-12. And I think that, when you're undefeated against the spread so far this season, the price has got to get too high on them here for a while. And you see them coming up playing some teams, UC Davis, Idaho, UTEP, some teams that they're going to be favored against UC Davis by quite a bit. They're going to be favored by a lot against IUPUI, just based on how well they've done so far this season. And I'm not sure that I would be interested in laying points with Washington State in those spots. This is still a Washington State team that needed overtime to beat Texas Southern in the first game and didn't beat Seattle that handily in the second game. I feel like this is a team that will be laying some big numbers in several games here in the next couple weeks, and I think they'll probably be too big.
No, that makes sense. And it's tough, too, the opposite side of the coin. I talk about mid-majors and their sustainability. When you're in a major conference and you're a bad team, 2 years ago, Washington State was 9-22. They won one game in Pac-12 play. They were 1-17. Last year, a little bit better. So they're on the right track. They were 13-18 last year with 6 Pac-12 wins. They're on the right track, but still, you have to get to a point in college basketball where you're able to prove this thing year in and year out. And beating St. Mary's is impressive. Beating San Diego State is impressive. But as we just talked about, St. Mary's isn't the same team. San Diego State hasn't been the same team for a few years now. So, for Washington State, those are big wins. They're good wins for the program. They're good wins to show the progress that they've made. But still, it doesn't make them a trustworthy team.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that Washington State is certainly improved, and I'm certainly not doubting that. But I think that against the number, it's going to be hard for them to cover these spreads going forward because I don't think they're as good as what they look so far this season. The other one I'm going to say is Central Michigan. The Chippewas have beaten up on some bad competition here in Sam Houston State, Cal Poly. They lost at Michigan 72-65. They beat Cal State Bakersfield, a decent win there on a neutral court on Saturday. Central Michigan's defensive numbers look pretty good this year, and I think those are due to regress. If you look at Central Michigan the last couple seasons, they've been really bad defensively. Last year, Ken Pomeroy had been ranked 345th out of 351 in defensive efficiency. So far this season, they've been pretty good defensively. They're not fouling anybody. They've fouled less people or committed less fouls than any other team in the country per game. That type of thing will probably regress toward the mean because the past couple of years they've been about average when it comes to fouls. I think this is one of those teams where they lost a lot from last year as well. You remember Keene there at Central Michigan, and this is just a team that doesn't have the star power that they've had in some years in the past. They play a really, really weak schedule here for a while. They play Jackson State, Southern Utah, UMKC. So maybe they're going to beat up on these teams for a while, but I think that this is a long-term look at fading a team that is likely to have a really good record. So far this year, they've been really good against the spread, and I imagine they'll have a really good straight-up record here in a few weeks when MAC play starts, and I think that could be a good time to look to go against them.
Well, and I love looking at teams like that. We kind of talked about that a little bit last week in terms of teams in college basketball can kind of pump their schedule or pump their records up a little bit because of the schedules that they play. On the flip side, you've got some teams that play just miserable and brutal non-conference schedules. The two that stand out from last year, Mount St. Mary's and Long Beach State, they're just all over the map. They're traveling a ton. They're playing teams that are much better than them, playing 4 road games in the span of 7 or 8 days. You're going to win a whole lot of those games. So that is something that's very important here as we get closer to conference play, is looking at strength of schedule rankings, looking at adjusted statistics based on the level of competition. That stuff is very important, and I'm glad that you hit on a team like that. And I'm sure those are teams that we'll continue to hit on here over the next few weeks.
Yeah, definitely. I like to look ahead. I know you do as well. I feel like there's spots where you can find these teams where they're going to beat up on some of these really bad teams, and perception of them has to go up for a while. And then you like to watch that, and you say, man, I hope they really run up the score in these games, because I really want to go against them here in a few games when they start playing somebody good. I wanted to say really quickly, I know we usually don't talk about them. Most of their games aren't lined. Texas Southern out of the SWAC so far this year. Look at the schedule they've played. They've played Gonzaga, Washington State, Ohio State, Syracuse, Kansas, and Clemson, all on the road. So Mike Davis's team has kind of been the Long Beach State of this year, where they're just going and traveling, playing a ridiculous schedule. We'll see how it works out for them. Looks like they don't play a game at home until January 1st, so pretty ridiculous schedule there.
Yeah, they don't play a game at home until January 1st. They're playing Oakland later this week, at Toledo, at Oregon, who's obviously a good team, at Baylor, who's another good team, at Wyoming in the altitude, just with one travel day in between after that game in Waco. Then they go back to Texas and play TCU. They're going to play the 11th, 14th, 16th, 18th, and then wrap up the road schedule on the 23rd in BYU. So you got game in altitude in Laramie, then you go down to Fort Worth, another game in altitude in Provo. That is a miserable schedule for Texas Southern, and most of those games are going to be lined because they're playing really notable competition. So a good team to bring up there. As we transition to looking at a couple of games here, and we're going to talk about your thought process, how you sort of go through these games. And again, when we do some of these look-aheads with some of these games, we're not going to have lines on them because of the time that we're recording this show. Try to give you a little bit of lead time, give you some thoughts on where Kyle's at for these games. But a good one tomorrow night between Baylor and Xavier, 6:30 Eastern time for this one, top 25 matchup. This is a game that's on your radar.
Yeah, Baylor's a defensive team. Xavier's been really good on offense. These two teams do it a lot different ways, and I like games like this where you have one team that wants to push the tempo, one that wants to slow it down. Xavier plays very fast. Baylor always plays very slow under Scott Drew, and you have to give Scott Drew credit for the fact that his defenses have been really consistently good the last few seasons. Xavier's shooting 66.5% on two-point shots so far this year. Xavier had that really good win at Wisconsin. Wisconsin's certainly not as good this year, but certainly anytime you go to Wisconsin and win, that's an impressive win. They lost last game against Arizona State, gave up 102 points in that game. So it's going to be interesting to see how they bounce back here. They go home and play Baylor. And then what's really interesting to me about this one is Xavier plays Cincinnati the game after that. Obviously, the crosstown rivals, that's a huge game for Xavier. I don't think they'll overlook Baylor because they know that Baylor's really good. But you have to wonder if there's at least one eye looking ahead towards Cincinnati. Baylor, they've been undefeated so far this year. They haven't played for a while. They're going to have a week off before they play this game. They beat Wisconsin on a neutral. They beat Creighton on a neutral. But other than that, they didn't play anybody good in those first few games. But, I think that this is an interesting game to see going forward how good Baylor actually is. I think Baylor's a good team. I think defensively they could give Xavier some trouble here. And my lean here would be the under. I think that Baylor is so good at controlling the tempo and forcing you to play their style of basketball that we probably see a total of something 146, 147. And if it's that high, I would look to lean toward the under, and I may even play it myself.
First true road game for Baylor, so we'll see how they handle that type of atmosphere. And then, of course, Baylor with an interesting – it's not a look-ahead spot for them. It's certainly not in the same breath as Xavier playing the crosstown rivalry. But Baylor plays Wichita State after that, and that'll be a big game once we get to the selection committee process in terms of seeding. So that'll be one that, Baylor will have circled, a home game there. And also good to see Wichita State getting somebody to schedule them in the non-conference portion. That's always exciting because that's a team that, consistently gets underranked in the tournament because, nobody wants to play them. And I certainly can't blame, Power 5 conference teams for that don't want to play Wichita, don't want to run the risk of racking up that non-conference loss because you're going to lose games in conference play. So you want to try to limit the number of losses as much as possible. One other game that you want to look at here We'll go all the way out to Thursday night. This one on ESPN, top 5 matchup between Notre Dame and Michigan State up there in East Lansing. Sparty will be probably a little bit of a favorite here for this one, but again, you always have a reason for the games that we discuss. So what is it with this one?
Well, I like this one because Michigan State coming off that win against North Carolina, where North Carolina shot just a ridiculously low percentage from the floor. There were 72 possessions in that game, and it finished 63-45. So some really, really poor shooting numbers. That was a game on the neutral floor. That was a good neutral site under there early in the season. Michigan State's been really good on defense against everybody other than Duke so far this year. And Duke's going to score a lot of points on everybody this season. But, you look at Michigan State, they play against a team here in Notre Dame that is so efficient on offense. Notre Dame every single year is way up there as far as offensive efficiency. They're always in the top 20, usually in the top 10. A few years ago, they were second in 2015 in efficiency on offense. And then in 2016, ninth. Last year, not quite as good, 18th. So far this year, they're third in offensive efficiency, playing against a Michigan State team that so far is fourth in defensive efficiency. So I wanted to talk about this one because I think it's strength versus strength. Notre Dame's defense isn't nearly as good as Michigan State's. And I think that's where Michigan State has the pretty big edge here, is that they can do it on both sides. I think Michigan State will probably be favored by 5 or 5.5 points in this one. I don't have a strong lean in this game. I think it's just going to be interesting to see if Michigan State's defense can continue to be that good. Like I say, Notre Dame is so efficient. Colson's really good as a guy that has the ball in his hands a lot for Notre Dame. And I think Bonzie Colson's certainly one of the best players in the country. He's very efficient. Let's see how Michigan State matches up against him. And then also, Notre Dame has at DePaul, which is, not that tough of a road game. Now they go to Michigan State, their first really difficult road game of the year. It'll be interesting to see what Notre Dame does here in this one. I'm not doubting Notre Dame. I think that was a really good win against Wichita State. But I think that this is a really big test for both teams because Notre Dame coming off a massive win against Wichita State, Michigan State coming off a game against North Carolina where Tom Izzo beats Roy Williams for the first time. So let's see who can keep their success going. And I think, both of these teams are in a little bit of a letdown mode because they're coming off such big wins. So, coaching-wise, I think Izzo and Notre Dame's name escapes me, Mike Bray, sorry. Mike Bray is a really good coach as well. So 2 good coaches. We'll see who's best prepared for this one.
Well, we'll do some more college basketball stuff as we go forward here. And, of course, next week, a little bit of a lighter college football schedule with the Army-Navy game, which we will talk about here on the show. Then also maybe look at some bowl season stuff and some coaching stuff. So we should be able to dig in a little bit more to college basketball over the next few weeks. But Kyle Hunter from HunterSportsPicks.com, what's going on over at the website right now, man?
Well, like I said, a nice run here of late, 16-5 in my last 21, 9-0 in my last 9 basketball plays. I'm starting a special today where I'm going to sell college basketball and NBA totals only for the rest of the season. And most of my volume in both of those sports is in the totals market for $499. So, the season's really young. There'll be a lot of plays on that one. So $499. If you're interested in that, contact me, Kyle at HunterSportsPicks.com or at KyleHunterPicks on Twitter.
Well, Kyle, always a treat, man. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, man.